So welcome back. I hope you had a good break. I was peeking in at the congregate tables and there was a lively discussion going on. So I was really happy to see that. We'll keep that going. This third session is devoted to teaching physics, and the chair of the session is Shannon, who you heard speak this morning. So I'll turn it over to you, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, I was really excited to be able to chair this session, and I'm really excited for all three of these talks. Our first speaker is Jeremy Secor from Elyria High School. And as a teacher relatively new to the modeling world, the subject of this talk is really interesting to me, and it's discourse management in a modeling instruction classroom. So I'm excited.
Hi, I'd like to talk today about the way we engage in questioning and dialogue with students. But first, a quick story about a horse. About 100 years ago, a German man by the name of Van Osten taught his horse, named Clever Hans, to do arithmetic. Or at least Van Osten really did believe that he had taught his horse to do arithmetic. But just like you're skeptical right now, so were his contemporaries. After careful observation, it turned out that Clever Hans could only give correct answers, which he did by stamping his feet, if he could see Van Osten and if Van Osten already knew the answer. Hans wasn't doing arithmetic. He was responding to unintentional cues from his teacher. So what cues do we give our students that fool us into believing they've learned what we wanted them to learn? If you've ever wondered, how can my students seem to understand something one minute and seem completely clueless the next, you're not alone. It may be that, like Van Osten, we teachers have cues that our students use to fool us into believing they've learned what we wanted them to learn. I think the keys to these problems lie in how we ask students questions and how we react to their responses. The goal in my classroom when I'm asking questions is not to hear correct answers told back to me. My goal is to get as many students as possible discussing an idea from multiple viewpoints. I hope that by the end of the discussion, they can arrive at some sort of consensus on what they think is true and why they think that, or they can agree on what the class needs to resolve in order to find that clarity. My role in this is to make sure students are hearing all voices, treating each other respectfully, and asking new follow-up questions to help the group get unstuck, if necessary. How do we build a classroom culture that can accomplish this? Just like Van Osten, we naturally have tells that reveal to students what we think of their responses. But we can train ourselves to not show them. I don't want my students to answer my question based on their expectations of what I want them to say. I want them to answer based on what they're actually thinking. How else can I expect to find out what they think, and therefore how to teach them next? First, it is important for teachers to stop anticipating right and wrong answers, and instead to anticipate answers that we agree with or disagree with. Whether a student gives a response I agree with or a response that I disagree with, I have trained myself to react in the same way. Same facial expression, same follow-up question. Every teacher is different. For some, maybe that's an affirming yet neutral response. Others might find it better to receive every response with great enthusiasm. Wow, I love that. But whatever you do, treat all student responses equally and as though they are interesting. And when I say our reactions should be the same, I mean tone of voice, I mean body language, I mean choice of follow-up questions. Our choice of follow-up questions is critical. Our line of questioning can shut down the discussion, it can move the discussion in a different direction, or it can cause students to rethink their ideas on the topic in a new way. Some common follow-up questions I like to ask include, have you seen any evidence that supports your idea? Or, why do you think that's true? I'll ask those questions whether I agree or disagree with the student's idea, because either way, it will prompt clarification of the thought process and help other students evaluate the claim. Sometimes a student gives a response where my first internal reaction is, what? Because their response runs counter to all of our prior observations or learning. We've all been there. The student response is so out there that it's hard to know how to react without coming across as insulting the student. But what I've also found is that simply asking the question, can you tell me more about that, is often very illuminating. By neutrally asking for more information, I often find out that what at first sounded to me like a nonsensical answer is actually very insightful. It just didn't appear so at first because the student was addressing something a little different than what I thought I was asking. By asking for clarification in a student's thinking, especially when it sounds like an outlandish answer, I often find students can add new layers of richness to our conversation, maybe even something I hadn't thought about in that context before. We just have to choose to give them the opportunity to explain themselves. This kind of response, the apparently nonsensical answer that's actually deeply insightful, frequently comes from students who in a typical classroom might be seen in a negative light. Perhaps they're neurodivergent, or they have a different cultural background from their teacher. Many students have plenty to offer in intellectual discussion, but may be overlooked when we don't make it a habit to probe for understanding. Likewise, when students give right answers, we must ask them to justify their responses or add context. This can reveal whether they have figured out how to say the thing they're supposed to say, or whether they have gaps in understanding. Also, if we don't ask for that justification when we agree, then we're signaling our agreement, and students will definitely pick up on that. If we don't probe the responses that sound great at first also, then we are assuring ourselves that a surface-level understanding necessarily means a deep understanding, and I don't think that I want to do that. By asking for further explanation from great-sounding responses and strange-seeming responses and everything in between, we communicate the same level of expectation and the same care for their thoughts to all of our students. A key consideration is how our students feel about our lines of questioning and our push for deeper responses. My students, when they first come to my class, are not accustomed to this style of questioning. They're accustomed to getting instant feedback on whether they're right or wrong. But they don't get that from me. They just get a follow-up question, or the class discussing whether they agree. Teachers need to be careful and compassionate here because we're asking students to step out of their comfort zones. We are asking students to accept ambiguity and to accept that being wrong is not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, being wrong, when thoughtfully examined, is often very helpful to building a better understanding. Now, I like to be right, and you probably do too. So do our students. It took me years to come to embrace that my being wrong isn't necessarily bad. So I remind myself of that. A single pep talk about how great it can be to be wrong will not make students magically buy into this concept forever. We need to explicitly highlight the ways that students have good ideas that turn out to not work, yet they still move our discussion forward. We need to celebrate the value in pursuing ideas without knowing in advance whether those ideas will be the ones that last, or whether they're stepping stones towards a later idea. But again, this is not a student's typical experience with wrong answers in school, so we need to revisit and highlight this concept explicitly with our students over and over. It is also essential that we carefully monitor how much individual students speak, ensuring that no one student or group of students dominates the discussion, and that everyone has an opportunity for input. Further, we need to explicitly teach students to value a variety of perspectives and that everyone has equal belonging and value to our community of learners. If we allow some students to dominate conversation, we are sending the unintended message to other students that we're satisfied with those few students doing all of the talking. And without a climate of mutual respect among all participants, many students will not feel welcome or valued. And none of us want to participate in communities that make us feel bad about ourselves. So careful, deliberate, and repeated attention and explicit discussion of the climate of the classroom is essential to maximizing the value of dialogue and maximizing participation. So, what are some potential pitfalls in running a classroom that revolves around dialogue? The most important to me is probably the error of letting standards slip for the culture of the room. We must constantly reinforce throughout the year what our values are in terms of expecting that everyone in the room treats everyone else as a person who has value to bring to each discussion, and to live those values in holding everyone to the same high standard for how to share and, more importantly, how to listen. Next, are we asking questions to hear students say the one correct answer, or are we asking questions to provoke deeper thought? Let's always do our best to not settle for asking questions that can be answered with one word or one phrase that's clearly identifiable as the correct answer. Another pitfall is the trap of deficit thinking when our dialogue is not going as well as we planned. And there will definitely be times when it does not go as well as planned. If students aren't giving good responses to our questions, we must not blame them for our failed discussion. We must just ask new questions. So often, I've asked what I thought was a great question, but my students just didn't understand what I meant. Instead of being defensive about the quality of my very well-considered question, I need to just ask a different question to try to lead to the same point. Always be willing to abandon a question when it's not working and try a new question. Remember that the goal is not an answer to your question. The question is just a means to get students thinking about and talking about the ideas they're learning. So when one line of questioning isn't working, abandon it and try a new approach. And maybe some days, because of other events in the school or events in the world, it's just not going to happen and we need to adjust. Another way that we can go wrong is assuming that because some of our students are in agreement and satisfied with their ideas does not mean that everyone is ready to move on. We don't move our class at the pace of the fastest person at that moment, so our discussions shouldn't either. Stop and ensure that you have genuine agreement rather than letting a small minority of students speak for all. One last pitfall I want to bring up is filling the silence. When you have a room full of students who are thinking deeply and trying to process what other people are saying and trying to figure out how that affects their thoughts, you are going to experience moments of silence. Embrace them. They'll be awkward. That's okay. Embrace the awkwardness of a room full of people trying to think together. There will be quiet for long stretches. There will be noise. There will be disagreement. Definitely make sure that you enforce respectfulness through those disagreements, though. So, if we want to find out what our students are really thinking and not fall into the trap of Van Austen, we need to create opportunities in our classrooms for our students to feel comfortable and safe enough to speak their true thoughts. That takes deliberate effort and practice. We need to create opportunities in our classrooms for our students to follow up on their initial thoughts, to explain not just what they think, but why they think that, or what led them to that idea. We need to work carefully on our visual and verbal reactions to student responses. We need to treat ideas we agree with and ideas we disagree with as equally worthy of consideration. And we need to embrace how difficult it is to lead a group of humans thinking together, not take it personally when it doesn't go perfectly, and never stop trying to ask probing questions to help students refine their thinking. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There's been some really awesome discussion already in the chat, and I think some questions already coming up. As Eric mentioned earlier, I think you're going to come up to the top of the list for me if you raise your hand. And I think the first question is from Mary. So Mary, if you want to unmute yourself.
I'm Mary. I teach in Washington State. That was a great presentation, and I just have kind of one quick question. I have a lot of kids who are really open and willing to talk in front of the class, but I always find it really challenging when I have those couple of kids who are really, really painfully shy and afraid to be wrong, so they don't want to speak in front of the class. Do you have any tips on how to get them to open up and be comfortable speaking in front of the class and not necessarily knowing whether or not they have the right answer?
Thanks, Mary. As a very introverted person, this is really important to me. I never want to make my students feel worse for being in my room than if they hadn't come at all that day. That's the worst thing I could do. And there are students who, if I cold call on them, they're going to freeze up and they're going to panic. And if they're afraid that I might do that, then that's the only thing they're going to think about the whole class. That was an E&M course I took as a junior in college, where I knew I was going to get called on randomly, and that was the only thing I could think about for that whole class all semester. That was hard for me, and I don't want to do that to my students. So I want to invite my students to speak, but I don't want to ever force it on them. I think forcing dialogue onto people is a great way to make them not want to engage, and to do it or to do it only at a surface level. And I'm seeing in the chat right now, just because they're quiet doesn't mean their mind is quiet. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. I remember I had a student my first year teaching who then took my AP class my second year, and I was just lucky to have that kid right away, because he just sat there silently while I, still didn't know how to teach at the beginning of my career. And I had no idea what this kid thought at all until, we took our first test, and he had just the most amazing, beautiful work. And so to me, that was right away an indicator that, like what a student does out loud and what's going on in their head don't match up necessarily. But getting back to directly addressing your question, what I really like to do is to try to find ways to invite students into the dialogue and let them make the choice of whether or not they do or don't actually speak out on that. When maybe they're in small groups talking before we have our large group conversation, or in the middle of our large group conversation, I turn to your table mates and talk about that for a minute, and then we'll come back to the big chat. And I hear somebody who's one of those students who doesn't want to talk in class, or who's just really reluctant, they're shy. And, I overhear them say something really interesting, and I'll just tell them like, wow, the thing you're saying right now is really interesting to me. And I love that the three of you are having this conversation, but I think the rest of the room could benefit from hearing your thoughts. So could you just consider bringing that up if you feel comfortable? And so what I think is helpful about that is that it gives that student some validation before they speak up in front of everybody, that I think that what they have to say is valuable, and hopefully that helps them get over that fear of speaking out loud, because they know that I'm going to be supportive. Is that helpful, Mary?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. What a great question to start off with. I think we have plenty more hands to raise. I think I saw Jose next.
Okay. Hi, Jeremy. It was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoy it. And I think a lot of lessons for teaching freshman physics in college come this way. My question is, how these ideas apply depending on the size of the classroom? There's a big difference. I'm teaching 20 students, 40 students, or 100. You have some experience and give some tips on how do I do and implement these things. For example, particularly in the case when you have gigantic classrooms, over 100 students in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jose. I don't have any direct experience teaching a class as large as 100 or more. But my first thought on that would be to, instead of trying to have 100 people all talking at once, maybe to divide into small groups and then asking for representatives of each group.
So would you recommend in a situation like that to have a lot of pre-class assignments where people talk before they come to class, or things like that, stuff doing afterwards, or a combination of both? Any thoughts on that direction?
I think that would largely depend on the details of the exact conversation that I want to have with the class. Like if we're talking about, maybe we watched a phenomenon together, and, this ball rolled off the table, did it take more time, less time, same time as a ball that would just fall straight down? Maybe that's something that we're just watching and thinking about in that moment. Or maybe we're having a dialogue about, something that I did pre-assign you know, and tell them, come back ready to discuss this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, great. And I see Kevin's hand. Kevin?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm Kevin. I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. I wanted to ask about the flip side of the shy kid. I've experienced many students that are maybe even over eager to share in class, and then the other kids treat them like a shield, and then they are then inadvertently discouraged from participating in the class discussion. Do you have any tips on how to let other people play without discouraging the one that always has their hand raised?
Yes. Yes, Kevin, thanks. That is a great way to kill a dialogue, is to have one or two kids in the room who every time somebody else isn't talking, they take that as their invitation to deliver a monologue. Or, you know, like, if nobody else is speaking, then I'm going to speak. And maybe if somebody else is speaking, I'll speak anyway. And I struggled for a while to figure out how to work with those students. And that's why I think it's so important to lay the ground rules right from the start of the school year. And one of my most important ground rules, well, a couple things tie together. First of all, is the value that we do our best learning and we do our best thinking when we're hearing a wide variety of perspectives. Because it helps us look at a question, look at a problem from multiple angles. And so if we're going to value all of these different perspectives from people of different backgrounds in the room, then we need to be able to hear from all of these people. And so if we're going to have good dialogue, then it is absolutely essential that every person in the room, teacher included, pay attention to and actively monitor their listening versus their speaking. And so by having conversation about that right up front, then it's a pretty easy reminder when one student is starting to dominate conversation, that I can just remind them, and I want to be positive about it, you know, like, thank you, I love your enthusiasm today, but I just want to remind you that we need to balance our listening and our talking, and we've heard a lot from you, and I really appreciate that, but we also definitely need to hear some other people's thoughts. And so just establishing from week one of the school year that that's an important thing for the best dialogue we can have, then it becomes pretty easy to remind students. And that has worked out well for me for the last couple of years.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
All right. I don't see any other hand raised, but I have at least one question for you. So I think one thing that I'm definitely working on in my classroom is making it as student-centered as possible, and part of that is definitely modeling. And throughout the year, I really want to push my students to be asking some of the questions, and not the questioning not always doing with me. And so I was wondering, do you have any tips for how to get students to kind of hold each other accountable for questions like you mentioned in your talk? Have you seen any evidence that supports that idea? And then what balance do you try to have between teacher questioning and student questioning each other?
Thanks, Shannon. I like that question a lot. To me, I think the important thing that I didn't realize right away when I started doing this in my teaching is that my students don't automatically know how to ask each other questions. They're accustomed to answering teacher questions. They're not accustomed to asking each other, or they're accustomed to asking me a question, but they're not accustomed to asking each other questions. And so I have to be mindful that this is a new skill for them. And what we do when we have students who need a skill but don't have that skill is we teach it to them. So how do we teach it to them? I like to, well, first of all, I model for them the kind of question that I want to ask. And so early in the school year, I do more question asking than students do. But my goal is really over the course of the year to shift the questioning less and less and less of me, more and more and more of them. Sometimes early in the year, especially, maybe if I have them in small groups who worked together, who are then going to have a large conversation, and I have their work is on whiteboards, then I'll assign, without telling them what the roles are, somebody in your group is student A, somebody's B, somebody's C. And then, okay, so whoever is student B in your group, your job is to find a similarity among all groups. Student A, your responsibility is to find a difference. Student C, your responsibility is to ask somebody a question to help you understand something that isn't clear on their work. And so, I'm giving them a structured prompt for how to speak to each other. I also have, I'm putting in the chat right now, a link to a file, student discourse question stems. And this is something, it's a PowerPoint that I just printed out all the pages of this PowerPoint, and I have them laminated and posted around my classroom so that it just gives my students some examples of what kinds of questions to ask. And because they can see them on the walls, then that gives them some prompting. Or if they're holding whiteboards, I can put question prompts on the backs of whiteboards. And sometimes, you could maybe even, if you have like those laminated cards that I just shared, maybe you could hand one to a student and, like, can you find a way to work this question in? Like with those students who, that they are interested, you can see that they want a way into the dialogue, but they just don't know how to insert themselves in. Did I answer your question, Shannon?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. Mary, is your hand up from earlier, or do you have another question?
That was from earlier.
Okay, great. And then I think we have time for maybe one more question. Michael?
Excellent. Jeremy, I know you. So I want to ask a meta question. This was obviously a great presentation. And it really is about, if we want to talk about building our own network as high school teachers and improving our teaching, this type of expertise is really powerful to know is owned by a high school teacher. Could you tell me about how you built this expertise and how you came up with such a good presentation?
Well, that's, thanks, Michael. How I built that expertise is just by a whole lot of fumbling in the classroom, and just reflective thought for years, and about maybe 2 years ago, a little less than that, I was asked by a friend of mine to do a 3-hour module for the American Modeling Teachers Association, where she said, hey, you're really good at this. Can you lead a 3-hour module online about this? And I said, well, I don't think I'm actually very good at anything, but if you say so, I'll do it if you do it with me. And so my friend Teresa Marks and I twice now have led a 3-hour module for the American Modeling Teachers Association on this topic. Let's see, how did I put this presentation together? Well, I was asked to, and I wrote a script in 2 days and had my friend Teresa help me edit it. And there you have it. So much thanks to Teresa Marks for her behind the scenes input on this.
I'm also really excited for our second presentation here. It's from Elmarie Mortimer from Trinity Prep School in Winter Park, Florida. And I think it's something that really ties well into many of the things that we've already been discussing today. And so our talk is recognizing parallels between physics research and effective teaching.
Recognizing parallels between physics research and effective teaching. Hi, I'm Elmarie Mortimer, a high school science teacher at Trinity Preparatory School here in Winter Park, Florida. As you can tell by my accent, I'm not a native Floridian, although I've been living here for nearly 20 years, and it probably makes me more Floridian than most Floridians. I received my PhD in physics from the University of the Free State in South Africa, and was set on a research career in surface science, having spent a year at the postdoc at the Max Planck Institute in Düsseldorf, Germany, and then working as a materials scientist at the South African Accelerator Center, Itemba Labs in Cape Town. Today in my talk, I want to tell you about my journey into physics education. Bear in mind that I'm going to paint with broad brushstrokes, that the data that I'm going to present was not obtained with some in-depth research study in mind, but rather just me asking the question, is the physics program at Trinity Preparatory School on the right track? I will start with a background on how kids explore their world and how I use this knowledge to draw parallels between what I used to do in physics research and what I'm now doing in my physics classroom. I will emphasize the adjustments that I had to make to this whole process to make it relevant for the high school classroom in contrast to introductory physics course levels. I will present some data that our science department has used to evaluate the effectiveness of my teaching strategies, and then explains the balancing acts that I think will always be part of the high school physics classroom. I will wrap up my talk with some of the challenges that I've faced, and hopefully we can focus on discussing these challenges at the end of the talk. My introduction to education, started with my girls when they were little, and I took them to the Mommy and Me classes at our local preschool. We were exploring art and music and cooking together, and this had me thinking I would love to explore science with them too. So the Oo, Goo, and You class for toddlers in the age range 18 months to 3 years old was born. Those of you that have been around toddlers know that they are engaging with the world using all their senses. They want to see bubbles. They want to hear bubbles pop. They want to smell the bubbles. They want to be inside a bubble. They want to go and look at the world through a bubble. And they want to taste a bubble. Our explorations were always open-ended, teaching from my side, focused on establishing a vocabulary, very much based on the philosophy of Jan Parrish from Playful Early Learners, who said, don't teach a toddler what a tree is. Teach her, this is an oak tree. Teach her, this is a magnolia, and how to recognize the differences between them. I've tried to keep this playful exploration of the world through your senses in mind when I plan my high school lessons. A colleague observing one of my physics classes once remarked that he likes how I don't just teach a scientific method, I actually model it to my students throughout my lesson. And that got me thinking. Physics research uses this well-established paradigm of asking questions, reading, hypothesizing, and then testing these solutions. I tend to think of this as not a linear process, but rather a collection of tools that interact with each other, and that we then use to arrive at a conclusion and communicate it to our peers. And often we examine the question at the end to see if we look at it from a different angle, if our conclusion still holds. In the classroom, those same strategies still work. For a student to understand the science concepts, I cannot just lecture to them, work through a problem set, and then move on to the next concept. I have to provide them with opportunity to explore the concepts by allowing them to come up with an explanation or a model of their own. They have to be able to test their model and validate or improve it. But they also need to understand what the limit of the model is. What are the underlying principles that make the experiment work? And when will it no longer be valid? Is improving the model always the answer? Or do we sometimes accept the limitations of our model? What is the vocabulary that we use to signify these limitations? Frictionless lakes, people on ice skates. That one always leads to endless number of jokes in a hot, humid Florida. And then, of course, how do we use this vocabulary to construct an argument that answers our original question within the limitations of our model? What does this interactive approach look like in my classroom? I usually start, say, a unit with a demonstration. What happens when I drop the tennis ball? What vocabulary am I going to need to describe my observations? How are these observations currently being modeled? This is where we turn to group work and guided problem worksheets. Yes, working through old-fashioned problems still have a place in my classroom. The students usually understand that this is not the end goal of their learning. Their learning all comes together in our hands-on lab classes. How do we test these models? What equipment do we use to test these models? For example, at the start of the year, students will tell you that you measure time with a stopwatch. By the end of the dynamic unit, they're able to list at least 5 different direct ways to measure time. By the end of the school year, I challenge them to list all the different ways we use to determine the gravitational acceleration. And the bell usually rings before we have to complete the list. The labs progress from me holding their hand and leading them step by step through the process to where in a semester they're able to design their own experiments to say, test Newton's second law. And then finally, by the end of the school year, I will put something like a block hanging from a spring on their lab tables and ask them to design their own experiment. They pick what experiment they're going to perform, what equipment they are going to use, and what are the limitations on their experiment. And I can do all this. I can push really hard because my school has taught me 2 very important things. I have to take time to build relationships with my students. That is the only way that I know who and where I can push, when I can push harder and where I have to scale back and even start over. I have to understand the limits of my own classroom. What are the emotional quotient of my students? Who needs maybe a little boost in confidence and who needs a lesson in getting back up after a failing grade on a quiz and being able to push forward? Now, before I present my data, I just briefly want to tell you about our school. We're an independent liberal arts school that caters for learners in grades 6 through 12. Our student population usually hovers around 850 students per year, divided roughly into 120 students per year group in our 4 years of the upper school. Our classes are small, typically 11:1 student-faculty ratio. My task of teaching physics is being made easy by the fact that 63% of our faculty have advanced degrees. I don't have to worry about teaching math concepts, except for vectors in my physics classes. I don't have to worry about language and constructing arguments. My colleagues in the language and forensics and social study programs lay an excellent groundwork for that. I just focus on the physics. We have 4 physics courses that we teach: Honors Physics, AP Physics 1, AP Physics 2, and then a 1-year AP Physics C course where we cover both the mechanics and electricity and magnetism content. I'm going to show you data from my AP Physics 1 class. This course leads itself nicely to a benchmark because of the external curriculum and the international exam. So if you look at the graphs, you will see it's the scores for the last 3 years of the 4 years that I've been teaching the course. The 2020 data is only due July 19th and is therefore not included on this graph. Now, 2017 shows a nice bell-shaped curve. Most of the students earned a 3 on the exam. The class average, if you look on the table that I've put on the right-hand side of the slide, is 2.92. During my first year, my learning curve was probably much steeper than my students. they did not completely trust me. I was still the college professor that was trying to teach high school, and I had to learn how to navigate the emotional landscape of a teenager. 2018 started showing that my emphasis on the investigative teaching techniques was paying off. That was one of my strongest physics classes ever. 5 of the students, of the 7 students who earned a 5 on the class that year, took the rigorous AP Physics C course the next year, and they double 5'd in that course. And I think the big one was that all 5 of them chose STEM careers, or chose going into STEM careers afterwards. And then, of course, in 2019, the class struck gold. We achieved that final 100% pass rate. My biggest worry was, am I really getting better at teaching physics, or am I just getting better at teaching to the test? So at the start of 2018, I had my students write the force concept inventory. I told them this was not a test. It was just a tool that I wanted to use to see where they were and where they were going to go as a class. They never got their scores back from that test that they wrote in the first week of the school. They retook the force concept inventory after the AP exam, and the results are shown on the graph on the left-hand side, where the blue shows the first week of school, and then the class gains in the after the AP exam. In fact, I've just highlighted the gains with the graph that I had on the right-hand side, where you can see all the students actually gained nicely, or had gains in their knowledge of the course. Just 2 things about this. The one thing is that the data from my 8 senior students are missing because their school year concluded with the AP exam, and I did not see them again after the exam. And so that's one of the reasons where the number of students that took the course or the test at the beginning is much higher than the students at the end. Of course, I was hoping to do the similar test this year with the 2019-20 students, but unfortunately, COVID-19 hit, and we switched to remote learning at the beginning of, or the end of March, beginning of April. And so I was not going to put myself or my students through the extra stress of trying to administer the course or this test remotely. And so that data point was never recorded. So what am I taking away from all of this? There are some balancing acts that I have to deal with. Time is always in short supply. I've started using my summers for my own learning, exploring, and evaluating of my courses. When the school starts, I need to know what I'm going to use and what approaches I'm going to follow, because there's no time for detailed lesson planning. I have to focus on building relationships, giving feedback to my students, and getting through the curriculum. At the same time, I have to be flexible. I can't just have a one-way or just have one way of teaching a topic. I have to be able to assess and adjust and continue, because something that you do one year in your class will fail miserably the next year. But probably the most challenging balancing act is just managing expectations. The students and their parents' dreams and their dream grade does not always align with the academic rigor of the physics courses. And I have to constantly adjust and encourage and pacify the students there. So what more do I want to see in my physics classroom? Definitely more creativity. Too many students still think it is my duty to teach them. In other words, give them an answer so they can regurgitate it in the exam. I would love to see less competition. It really adversely affects the diversity in my class, physics classroom. We always need more time to question, more time to explore. I would love to teach my whole class just from the headlines of the newspapers, but time is a constant enemy. I also worry about my average students who think that, and I have to say average students, because they think that because they did not get a 5 on the AP exam, they're not ready for a career in physics. At the same time, I worry about my stellar students who think or may think that a 5 on the AP exam is their golden ticket to academic excellence. And it is not, because this is just the start of their journey. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We've had a very lively chat again. And then again, if you just want to go to the participants and raise your hand if you have a question. I do think there was one question in the chat that I think we wanted to explore during this time, which was using the force concept inventory. Elmarie, I think you said you only use it for your AP students. Maybe you want to explain that a little bit and talk a little bit about that assessment too, if people aren't familiar.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. One of the things that I found with this force concept inventory, and if you look at that data that I showed there, you'll see there's a drop in the number of students that took it. So it was, one was the 8 senior students. But the interesting thing is that I have every year at least 3 or 4 students that take the force concept inventory in the beginning and then decide, this is it. Physics is not for me. This is too difficult. And so they just drop out, give up, move over to the honors course. And so as a department, we've decided, just to prevent that negative association with physics, we decided to use it just for our AP students and not expand it into the honors program because of the rigor that's sort of implied in this whole inventory.
It's a really important point, yeah. Other questions? So if someone doesn't have one, I had a question for you. Definitely I'm an AP Physics 1 teacher, so that experimental design piece is really important. I'm always looking for kind of scaffolds and ideas people have for helping students be able to design their own experiment. And what do you do to help students go from here are the directions to here's a phenomenon, help design an experiment for it?
Yes, so the one thing that I never do in my classroom let me just unmute myself. So I never put down instructions and say, this is what we're going to do today. Measure this, do this, these type of things. We always start out with just a question. So the first lab, for example, will be more looking at just the effect of statistics and measurement and how important your measurement tool is. And so I will start out with a question that asks, do old pennies weigh more than new pennies? And then in the class, we will spend some time saying, okay, how will we go about investigating this? Well, we need to measure. How will we measure? What tool are we going to use? Usually I add a second question later on, just because I know the students well enough. Is a triple beam balance more accurate than the electronic scale? And of course, the students always say, oh, the electronic scale is more accurate. And then we do go through all the measurements, and then in the end, when they analyze the data, they realize, nope, triple beam balance is as good as electronic balance. But there's no instructions. It's all, so in the beginning, I'm leading them step by step the whole way. Asking a question, letting them come up with solutions. Ask a question, let them come up with solutions. And then as the year progresses, I step back. I put the question up, and they need to be able to design the experiment. I'll go through and look at what they're doing and give hints here and there. In fact, I very often go, so we literally take the experiment, and so the second week we would go just in theory and discuss exactly what role theory plays. The third week we do experiment, let's discuss the experimental procedure. How well does your experimental procedure go back to your theory? So that's how it builds up on each other. And then by the second semester, it's literally me just throwing out questions. And then moving out to the point where the last 2 or 3 labs, they need to come up with the question that they can then design the experiment for.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think we have a question from Donna, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Elmarie. I have a question about these lab questions. How much time do these open-ended labs take?
Yes, got a very important question, because of course in the beginning of the year, so our classes are 3 45-minute, well, single classes, and then we've got a block period of 90 minutes. And usually in the beginning, it's 2 block periods that it takes me just to get them to speed up, because this interactive approach takes a long time. And yeah, I need to push them a little bit along as well. It's not never-ending time, unfortunately. But yes, it takes more time than giving them a procedure and say, go through it and do it.
So how do you find that balance between the time? Obviously it's valuable, right? Them doing the experiment and designing it and determining what they need to know and how to test it. How do you balance that with getting through content?
Well, and it's, again, very good question. It's sometimes it works wonderful. With one group of students, you can go through, everything just fits together. Another group of students, you struggle to get them to get that balance. What I do find is that, that's where I'm the one that initially said, I feel that you need to give the students a vocabulary. Maybe the better way of saying it is, we need to start out by teaching the student or reminding the student those concepts that they're on their long-term memory, bring that back up into their short-term memory so that they can then start going through these experiments quickly. I cannot just leave them and say, design the experiment, because it's going to take forever. We need to, it's constantly this, hey, you've got 10 minutes. What can you come up with in 10 minutes?
Okay. So shorter, you do, some of those are shorter time periods then, not 4 blocks or 2 blocks.
2 blocks. Well, in the beginning, it's at least 2 blocks. For those of you that do video analysis, I find video analysis take forever in the beginning. I need to teach the student just needs to get comfortable with the program. Then the next one, we're going to literally film the video and we're going to start analyzing the video. And then only in the 3rd lab can we get to analyzing the data and drawing conclusions from the data.
Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Oh, awesome. Christopher?
Yeah, hi, Elmarie. I sort of, it piqued my attention when you mentioned that you were the prototypical physics professor coming in to teach high school physics. And I bring that up because that's a little bit of the topic of my talk, which is next. And the idea that you have a different perspective to bring into the classroom, I think, is overlooked a lot. And I think it causes people to be nervous about you in a way that is probably unjustified, because I think those of us coming into the classroom from from other fields or from other settings bring an experience, and I would ask you along those lines, is there something specific you brought from your college teaching experience into the high school classroom that you think that you might not have brought otherwise, or you might not have had otherwise?
Yes, force concept inventory. When I was teaching at college level, it was just when they were starting to experiment with peer instruction in this interactive learning. And we were using our force concept inventory extensively there to just gauge how the students' thinking was going. And how successful the instruction was. And so one of the things that I did do when I started teaching at high school was to say, hey, I can easily use this tool for my high-level students as well. And so that was actually helpful. I think another big thing is just a little bit of a wider perspective on why we're doing physics and why we're teaching physics in high school, and understanding where it fits into the college curriculum, and what can you do with it by the time you get to the college, and then also further into the research. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Wonderful. Do we have one more question? If no one else has one, I do have one more question for you. I really love your talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you do any lab practicals for assessments, and if so, how do you kind of design those lab practicals?
Shannon, one of the biggest things that I always grapple with is this whole assessment thing. It always feels to me like in the end, I go to this binary assessment where the students get top points because they've done everything correctly, and the other students get a 0 because they didn't follow the instructions type of thing. Well, not the instructions, they didn't gain that understanding that they needed to. So short answer to your question, no, I've not, for the APs, I've never done a lab practical itself. It's always been, I follow the AP exam assessment. So multiple choice and free response, where some of the free response questions might be designing and experiment. But I'm extremely interested in project-based learning, and then actually how to assess project-based learning, because that's one of the big things that I struggle with, is how does your rubric look? And the other thing is also, when do the feedback end? Especially in the beginning, I got myself into this thing where students would write a lab report. I would make comments, they would correct the comments. It would come back and forth, 5, 6, 7 times. I was grading till past midnight, and I don't have the time to do that every single time. So it's that, when does feedback stop, when does assessment start, that I still grapple with.
Yeah, I definitely feel that for sure. It looks okay. We've like one more minute, and Brock just raised his hand. So Brock, do you have a question?
Yeah, and it's real quick, and it doesn't have to be answered right now. But if anybody sometime this week would like to discuss lab reports, that's something that I would like to talk about. That Elmarie's talk about labs made me think about lab reports. So I just wanted to put that out there. It doesn't have to be talked about right now, but maybe sometime this week, hopefully.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think I would love to have a discussion about project-based learning and assessment. I know probably many people might be using standards-based grading, and I'm moving that way myself next year. And so the intersection of all those things, lab reports, project-based learning, and assessments, is kind of jumbled up in my mind right now. Yeah, and so I'd love to have some discussions there.
Shannon, I'm absolutely delighted. Sorry for barging in here.
No.
I'm absolutely delighted to hear that, because I switched a couple of years ago to project-based learning. In large part because I read Alan's book, Alan November's book, who is online here too, and who will be our keynote on Friday. I read Alan's book, Who Owns the Learning? And I was starting to think about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. I'm teaching students who really don't want to learn physics. I mean, they're pre-meds, they want to go to medical school, they just have to take physics, or engineers who really want to get on to much more fun courses than physics. And it's been a life changer. So I'll try to work that into my talk on Wednesday.
And so we have one more talk before the end of the day and the end of the session here. And our speaker is Christopher Gray from LaSalle Academy in Providence, Rhode Island. And as someone who moved from chemistry research into high school teaching, this is definitely a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm really excited to hear us talk about teaching as a second career.
My name is Chris Gray. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this event and the National Science Foundation for funding it. I'd really like to thank LaSalle Academy in Providence, Rhode Island for giving me the opportunity to teach, and for my students who have given me the opportunity to be a better teacher every day, and they've helped me every day along the way, and my family for helping me to be a better person every day. So we're here to talk about teaching as a second career. And I think the first question a lot of you will have is, why discuss that? Why discuss second career teachers? Well, there's a lot of things that a second career professional brings to the table coming into the classroom. Obviously, we have degrees, right? We started out with a degree going into our initial career. A lot of times we have multiple degrees. But more importantly, we have a lot of life experience. We have job experience, and that can be very complementary to your faculty, especially if your faculty is made up of teachers who have started in the teaching profession straight out of college. A lot of us have life experience and job experience in the STEM fields. My own case, I was a surface warfare officer in the United States Navy and was using science and my physics degree every day. We have some real world experience in scientific experimentation, in engineering testing, and so on. And that goes well beyond just the military. It could be people coming out of an engineering career, or even a project manager career or something like that. And they want to maybe broaden themselves and try to start a career with a fresh start in a slightly different area that still capitalizes on all their experience. My own experience, probably the most illustrative experience that I had in my Navy career that would be contributory to going into being a physics teacher. I was the shipboard weapons officer responsible for handling, preparing, and launching a Navy LEAP anti-ballistic missile prototype many years ago. And all of that science required is something that I can bring to the classroom and talk about as something that is not just an equation. It's not just a theory, but it's an actual application. And I think that contributes to the learning of the students. And anybody in my situation, anybody coming into a teaching career after a successful first career is going to bring that kind of experience into the classroom with them. Those of us coming into teaching as a second career, we've dealt with results-driven, task-oriented organizations. We understand metrics. We understand remediation. We understand deadlines and corrective action. We understand constraints. We understand that you can have it fast, you can have it cheap, and you can have it good, but you only get 2 out of those 3, right? That's the triple constraint of engineering. And making students aware of that is gives some flavor to what they're getting out of their textbook, or what they're getting out of your lessons or out of your labs. So the bottom line is, people coming into the teaching profession as a second career, we have complementary skills and experience that can really help round out a faculty and to make them have some different perspectives to offer to the students and some different real-world examples of how what they're learning in class matters to them. So let me tell you my story. I was a physics undergrad student at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And when I graduated, on the same day that I graduated, I was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy and started my career as a surface warfare officer. The Navy was fantastic. I got to see the world. It gave me all of the things I needed to start my family. I got to have a very fulfilling and successful career where I really accomplished some fantastic things that I'm very proud of, and that I won't bore you with today. But after 24 years, I was getting ready to wrap up my Navy career, and I was at a crossroads. One option was to continue working in the defense industry as a contractor or as a civilian government employee. And another option was to try other things. So my instinct was I wanted to try some other things first. And so I applied to several positions in many fields successfully. Got some great interviews, had a couple job offers, and which I ended up not taking. And I also interviewed to be a teacher, and that was a little more challenging, and it wasn't really as I expected it to be. I interviewed for several teaching positions, knowing that I did not have a state certification, knowing that a state certification was required, but also knowing that emergency certifications were being granted and certification requirements were being waived for certain subjects which were in demand and for which teachers were not readily available, and including physics and math, which I was going to attempt to specialize in. Unsurprisingly, I was not hired. So I looked at two different paths to try to continue to work my way into the teaching profession. One was called Troops to Teachers. It's a program that is co-sponsored by the Department of Defense and the Department of Education. And its objective is to inform people getting out of the military about the opportunities of going into the teaching profession, and to promote the teaching profession as an option for them as a second career, and also to make them aware of what the requirements are. What Troops to Teachers does not do is it does not help prepare you for the classroom. It does not give you any coaching or instruction on what you need to do to be a better teacher. It also does not help you navigate the requirements of certifications. Troops to Teachers as a program relies very heavily on alternative certification methods in different states. And that leads me to the second path I followed. And that was called the Rhode Island Teaching Fellows. So I'm in Rhode Island. And at the time, that was the alternative teaching certification program for the state of Rhode Island. And it was a fantastic program. And I emphasize was because that program is now defunct. And unless they've started one very recently, there is no alternative teaching certification program in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island Teaching Fellows is a fantastic program with the intent of filling teaching positions in high-need districts, especially in the STEM fields, with qualified, high-quality candidates. And they had a very stringent selection process, and they selected some great people. And fortunately, I was among them. So I was selected to be a Rhode Island Teaching Fellow, and I was very impressed with my my fellow colleagues that were also selected with me. And the difference between me and them, however, was that I was in my late 40s, and I was going into a second career after a very long, successful first career, with a family, with a mortgage, with a large number of financial obligations that I could not easily set aside. The majority of my cohort in that program were students either just out of college who had taken degree programs that did not lead to a certification, or who had worked for a few years out of college and were looking to do something different. And they were all great. But the requirements of the Rhode Island Teaching Fellows were that you accept whatever entry level position you were offered at one of the school systems that the program served. And after looking at it for some time, I made the difficult decision to withdraw from the program because I absolutely could not afford a pay cut to the extent that would drop me down to the very first step on the 10-step pay scale that these schools use here. And I was unhappy about that, but I think the responsible choice was to not set aside the financial obligations. I just was not able to make ends meet at that pay scale. I needed something higher than that, and the program did not support being hired at a higher pay scale. So in the end, I made the difficult decision to withdraw from the program, and I took a job as a defense contractor. And I did that for a couple of years, and I did some satisfying, fulfilling work for a couple of years, still with the goal toward transitioning into teaching at some point in the future. I eventually found a position at LaSalle Academy in Providence, which is a private Catholic school, which therefore does not need to meet the same requirements as a public school with regard to hiring teachers with certifications, and which had some flexibility in what they were able to offer me with regard to pay. And it was a great match. So they were able to bring me on in the middle of the pay scale, and they were able to overlook the fact that I did not have a certification, and they were able to depend on the other experience, the other teaching experience that I got in the military, the other things that were on my resume, and were able to hire me. And it's been a fantastic pairing ever since. I think they're very happy with me. I'm extraordinarily happy with them, and it's gone very well. Which brings us to the things that I think schools should consider when looking to expand their faculty, and in particular to bring on second career professionals to round out their faculty and to bring some of those great things that second career professionals have to offer that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. We need the hurdles of certification to be smoothed out. We need some kind of consistent, standardized program for alternative teacher certification that is similar from state to state to state. That should expand and grow programs like Troops to Teachers and bring them into places, not necessarily just the military, but other places where professionals might be looking to leave their current career and go into something different for a fresh start. It should expand and build on programs like Rhode Island Teaching Fellows to give us some initial classroom coaching to help us make our first days in the classroom more successful, but also allow us to navigate that certification process and to allow us, if our resumes warrant and if our experience warrants, to enter the teaching community at somewhere other than an entry-level pay scale. We need some kind of administrative support along those lines that is consistent from state to state. I'll give you one more example. The Troops to Teachers justifiably advertises some of their success stories. They have many people that have come out of the military, and within a few years of entering the classroom, they've been selected as Teacher of the Year for the state or Teacher of the Year for the district where they are. And if you ever look at their website, you'll see those people being advertised. That kind of success story for a program like this, I think, would go a long way toward justifying the expense of bringing in an experienced professional into the classroom and allow you to pay them at somewhat higher rate than another different first-year teacher. I think we can all agree in general that teacher salaries should probably get a boost across the board. But in this particular case, I think that teacher salaries for first-year teachers who have 20 years of experience elsewhere should be a little higher. Without that, though, without being able to start at a slightly higher salary above entry scale, second-year professionals are probably going to look elsewhere and not bring their talents to the classroom, which would be unfortunate because I think, again, later in life, experienced professionals have a lot to offer, have a lot of things that they can contribute to the classroom. And in general, I think it would do a lot of great things for teaching, especially in the STEM fields, which is what we're looking at today. So thank you for letting me share my story. I appreciate your attention and the time you've given me. And I believe we're going to transition now to questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. There's again, a very, very active chat. Trying to see if any questions in the chat didn't get answered. If anyone has a question, again, please use the raise hand feature in the participant area. All right, awesome. Doc Roth?
Hello, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Thank you for this. I think there will have to be an alternation for the office of Secretary of Education between you and the first speaker of the day, who had so many good things to say about the work we collectively do. It's not, well, I came to this business in my 40s after working in astrophysics and journalism, and I just took the emergency license test, which is like the SAT-2 in physics, and mailed in my diplomas in Massachusetts and got to start inflicting myself on students. There's much debate about, some people said, oh, just go, because they weren't happy with their ed school experience, and other people said, no, I really learned a lot in my master's program, you can do that. I will say, if I could do it over again, and because I was in the position to afford it, I wish I had done the education master's at one of our feet on the ground schools like UMass Lowell. But I didn't, and I've been making up for it ever since by doing PD and learning from my students. But I'm just curious if you have a feeling, sir, from other people you've talked to who've done the career change, should they be able to afford it? About the relative merits of going back to school and getting that master's degree, not necessarily to have the letters after your name or because you'll get paid more. I mean, some people would, some wouldn't. But because at its best, an education program will involve the mentoring, the student teaching, will sort of provide the opportunity for something that exists in a lot of fields, but usually not ours, which is apprenticeship. And to practice the art under the careful watch of a mentor. I'm just curious if, you know, in thinking about this and maybe talking to other career changers, what you see pros and cons for the different, again, with the proviso, assuming someone has the luxury to afford it, about whether it's worth going back and being part of a more formal teacher training thing, or you just jump in and start paddling. Thank you.
That's a great question. The short answer is I would say absolutely yes. I think those programs and that mentoring and that coaching would be phenomenal. Would make me a better teacher. The challenge, I think, is that the entry requirements into the profession, at least where I am, require a year of unpaid student teaching. And until that changes, you're not going to find very many people that can afford to just take a year off and not work and not collect a salary, which is a shame, because I think it closes the door to many people who would be very valuable additions to a classroom. If you can change that, and I think that's, you know, that's just basically the main point of my talk here today, is that there should be some policy changes put in place that sort of smooth that certification requirement out. And as luck would have it, the random number generator landed me in a breakout room right before this with somebody, very similar situation, coming from engineering. And in his state, he was able to get into a classroom, but he had some very onerous classwork requirements that he had to accomplish in his first 2 years in the classroom, which I think is also extraordinarily challenging. I mean, we've all had a first year in the classroom, and that is not an easy time that you want to be spending a whole bunch of time, you know, watching videos and reading textbooks to further yourself. I mean, you need to do professional development, but you also need to be able to dedicate your time and give your time to your classroom. And
maybe even see the wife and kids once a week.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe take a shower occasionally. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have another question from Robert.
Yes. So I like a lot of the points you brought up, and I think in the group chat I see a lot of the same conversation too, about the kind of normalizing, professionalizing a lot of different words. And one of the things that I've seen in the research that I'm doing is that a primary cert or secondary cert in physics is not an indicator of how well students are actually going to do. The professional age of a person or how long they've been teaching, kind of their experience has been the better predictor of student outcomes. And so I want to know kind of your perspective, because I haven't done any qualitative talking with this, but when you made that transition, what was kind of the biggest factor of your entrance in your first year of teaching? Was it kind of the hold of the material, or was it the hold of kind of classroom management, or the administrative aspect, or kind of any of those areas?
I would say that for me, and you know, who knows, it could be different for everybody, but for me, it was time planning and planning the flow. You know, how long was it going to take me to get through this material, and how could I synchronize the teaching with the lab and the exploration projects I wanted to do, and how I could make those all fit together in the schedule that I had in order to get to the end point on time. That's probably one of the things that in my first career was everybody was deadly serious about, was maintaining your schedule and staying on track for your schedule. And I found that to be profoundly difficult. And in you know, in the end, I think there were some things that we ended up giving short shrift to because I did not control the flow and the scheduling as well as I should have. My classroom was fantastic. I had some of the you know, you probably all remember the names of everybody in your first class, but they were all fantastic kids. And it wasn't classroom management. It wasn't the material. I had dusted off the material and I was pretty comfortable with all of it. It was the just how to synchronize all the different aspects of the lesson between the labs and the activities and the projects to get it done on time. But yeah, I hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, very insightful. Thank you.
All right. Remember, you can raise your hand using the participant section. Do we have any other questions here? Doc, you have another one?
Well, if I don't
go for it.
Yeah. One thing I'm just curious. I'm also curious about is whether active outreach to people already established in their careers, and in particularly in public service, whether that's the military, police, fire, who might be teachers, is also a way to do something that that I think we desperately need in our science departments, which is more diversity in our faculty in the high school. To have high school faculty, well, K-12, but yeah, to have our faculty begin to at least somewhat mirror the diversity in our student body.
That's an excellent point, and I would absolutely agree with you. And I see that in my own school and in my son's schools, and that's certainly something that you could build into a program like an expanded Troops for Teachers, which you know, or at least some program that reached out to people that were looking to transition into the teaching community, and help make them understand that that's an option. I absolutely think that would be worthwhile. I hate to say it, but I'd have to say that in a lot of fields, you know, diversity is a problem there as well, which is unfortunate. And you know, if you're looking at a program that's going to be bringing people into teaching from other fields, you're sort of dependent on their own diversity status, and you know, it's unfortunate.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Lynn? Lynn, I think you're muted. Sorry. You mute yourself.
I did sort of the opposite. I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics with minors in physics and secondary ed. I always appreciated the courses that I did take in secondary ed. But I went on and got an MA in physics and then a PhD in educational leadership. But my comment is that as an administrator in 2 different independent schools, as a secondary, in the secondary level, I was always more interested in people who had a solid foundation in the discipline, because I felt the department head and I could also work with that person and could help them get the courses that they might need to get the certification. Of course, non-public schools have different certification requirements, but I think there is a place for people who would like to teach physics as a second career. Thanks.
I would agree with that 100%. Thank you.
All right, I think that wraps us up. Eric, back to you.
Yes. It's unbelievable. You know, after months of planning to see this happening, to see everybody come on. I want to thank you, Shannon, for doing such a fantastic job chairing the session. I want to thank all of the presenters. I mean, this way exceeded my already high expectations. So thank you.